Yeah, then a kind of generalization of those partitioning methods here are so-called probabilistic methods, or also model-based methods, because they usually try to fit a probabilistic model, or a mixture of k probabilistic distributions models to the data. And as models or distributions, we typically use Gaussian distributions in that case. Yeah? So I just remember my statistics teacher in the university in one of the first semesters, and she actually said that, well, in the end, guys, no question about it, the entire world is just a mixture of k Gaussian distributions. Okay, yeah, so you can always, of course, represent the whole world as a mixture of k Gaussian distributions, and that's actually the idea here. Yeah, so you fit the parameters of k Gaussian distributions to the data. Yeah, the Gaussian distributions typically have the mean as one parameter and the standard deviation in the one-dimensional case, but typically we are in the multi-dimensional case. So in that case, the second parameter of Gaussian distributions beside the mean is the covariance matrix. Yeah, so you try to find k means and k covariance matrices such that the corresponding probabilities have the highest, the corresponding probability distributions model the data that you have in the best possible way. So in that case, you optimize typically the log likelihood of points belonging or being generated by these k distributions. Yeah? The generalization is that now it's the same idea. You try to partition the data into k clusters, but now you model the whole thing not only by the mean but by some distributions. Yeah, and that generates typically a kind of fuzzy clustering. So each point now belongs to all clusters. So in this case, each point belongs to exactly one cluster member, cluster representative. But here now, since we have k Gaussian distributions, so each point actually belongs to each cluster with a certain probability, of course. Yeah, and of course you can have a maximum likelihood assignment. So each point will be assigned to that cluster for which this point has the highest probability to belong to. That would be a hard clustering in that case, so to say. Yeah? Yeah, popular methods include especially the expectation maximization algorithmic schema. So the basic algorithmic schema of EM is very, very similar to partitioning algorithms or partitioning methods. You start off with some random models, random k Gaussian distributions. Reassignment of or assignments of points to distributions is basically computing the probability of each point to belong to each of the k distributions, and based on these probabilities of the individual points, you can recompute the k Gaussian distributions, so the mean and the covariance matrices of the k distributions. Yeah, and then again you recompute, which is the assignment step. You recompute the probabilities. And then you recompute the models, mean and covariance matrices, and so on and so on and so on. And again, the same conversions when nothing changes anymore, or the change is too small from one step to the next. In that case, then you stop. So that is meant by, typically it's the convergence is a little bit slower, but the basic algorithmic schema as before actually works also very well here, and that is the expectation maximization algorithm. Yeah, next up are the density-based methods. So this is a completely different idea of what the patterns of clusters are actually defined. So clusters here are viewed as regions of high point density separated by regions of low point density. So you see here, so if you take the light blue ones here, as long as you are in this area of the light blue points here, you are in a dense, depending on what density means, but somehow intuitively that is dense, right? And also the dark blue ones here and the green ones here, they have this is a dense area, and these clusters are separated from each other and also from these gray points, which are noise points, by regions where the density is very low. Yeah, so in between here is no point, so the density is low in this region here, and the same holds true here and here and so on and so on. Yeah. So the key concepts obviously is the definition of density. Is that dense enough to be considered as a cluster? Is this dense enough to be considered as a cluster? And so on and so on. And you typically need two ingredients for defining density, a density threshold, and that is first of all the minimum number of points in a volume, and of course the volume itself. Yeah, so you need the minimum number of points and in a volume, and you need to define the volume. Yeah, and there are different definitions to do that actually. So minimum number of points in a volume of a sphere, for example, or of a grid cell or something like that. Or you can use probability density with respect to a certain type of distribution. You can use a common mode within a volume and stuff like that. Yeah, so different ideas, different concepts how to define the density actually. And there are also, depending on these different definitions, various algorithmic schemata, which uses different concepts also of volumes, density tests, also connectivity of volumes that are dense. Yeah, so maybe you have some dense volume here, and this is connected to another dense volume here. So you somehow collect a chain of dense volumes, so to say, which are connected to each other. Yeah? So that is, for example, in dbScan, but other popular methods are grid-based clustering methods, DENCLU, which is basically based on these probability density definition or view of density. Mean shift, we will talk about mean shift a little bit closer or a little bit more in detail on one of the next slides. Yeah, but that is basically the idea of density-based methods. And then we have hierarchical methods, as you probably recall from KDM. So that is the idea that, here's the idea that we decompose the data in a hierarchical way, and hierarchies are typically represented in computer science by means of some trees. Yeah, the same as here. We use a tree to represent the hierarchical decomposition. The tree in that context is typically called a dendrogram. So dendro is Greek for tree. Yeah, so it makes sense that it's called a dendrogram. Typically, all those methods have a very close relationship to the minimum spanning tree problem. And here you see a dendrogram. Here you see the data set. And here you see the corresponding dendrogram with some specific algorithm that produced the dendrogram. And the interpretation of the dendrogram is quite easy. So you have at the leaves of the tree, which is down here, you have the individual points. So those are the most specific clusters, singleton clusters, trivial. And the root of the whole tree, of the entire tree, represents the entire data set, which is the most general cluster also. So these two things are, of course, the trivial clusters. But then an inner node, for example, this one here, represents the union of all the subtrees of this node here. Yeah, so maybe this is a more interesting one here. So this node here, for example, represents the cluster which is made up of all those points here in the corresponding subtrees, which is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, so this node represents the cluster made up of 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, so that's it. So the key concept is a similarity measure now between clusters, because you're in the middle here, so to say. So typically you start with the individual clusters here, and then merge two clusters if they are the closest ones that remain. So what you need is actually a similarity measure between clusters, for example, single link, average linkage, complete linkage, ward, or whatever. Yeah? And yeah, popular methods are, of course, these agglomerative linkage methods. Optics combines the ideas of hierarchical clustering and density-based clustering, actually. And the basic algorithmic schema I already told you is to merge the most similar clusters starting from the bottom of the hierarchy, from the singleton clusters, from the individual points. So we start with the individual points as clusters, and we merge in each step the two clusters which are most similar right now. And if we do that, at one point we merged everything together into just one big cluster, which is the root of the tree, which is the entire data set.